Hello, my name is Miles Fisher and I'm a retired diabetes specialist from Glasgow Royal Infirmary. I'm also one of the Friends of Glasgow Royal Infirmary. I'm delighted today to be here to interview a friend of mine who used to work in Glasgow Royal, whose name is John Quin. John's an author of a book that's just been published, and we're going to discuss the book with him today and some of his reminiscences and thoughts about Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Hello, John.
Hi, Miles. Thanks very much for having me along.
Very pleased. Now, I'm going to start by the question that many healthcare professionals dread, because it's the one that kind of kicks off your interview when you're going for promotion. So would you like to describe to us your medical CV? And perhaps you better explain what some of the roles are for the younger members of the audience that are watching.
Sure. I started at Glasgow University in 1978 and first came to the Royal Infirmary as a student in third year, so that'd be 1981, graduated in 83. And then in terms of the post-today foundation years and so on, I did my first year at the Royal Infirmary, 6 months doing my medical jobs and then 6 months in the surgical professorial unit. Then I did 2 years over at the Southern General in what was at that time called the SHO role, and then came back to the Royal Infirmary as a medical registrar. I spent 4 years then there, and then did a year on secondment out at Stirling, came back to the Royal, and then in 1992 got a senior registrar post down at King's in London. Was there for about 18 months or so, and then got a consultant's job down here in Brighton, where I worked for about 24 years as a consultant before retiring.
Okay, so several times you've been in the Royal Infirmary, as it were. So tell us about this book that you've just published, Dr. Quinn Medicine Man.
The title is ironic, of course. I mean, that was a TV show, an American TV show, which had Jane Seymour as the main actress. In fact, I don't even know if I actually saw the TV show. Maybe I did, I don't know. But what would happen would be maybe about certainly once a month, a patient would ask me what happened to my marriage to Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. That's the TV show, was called Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. And so that gag became a kind of running gag where I would talk about how Jane and she made the big time out in America and basically left me to, she became a massive star. So it became an in-joke, basically, and that's where the title comes from.
And the content of the book, what are the contents? What can the reader expect to find contained within?
Well, to do with the Royal Infirmary, basically the first half of the book's in two halves, Scotland, working in Scotland and working in England. So the first half of the book is very much my time at the Royal Infirmary. There's a little bit about the Southern General, as was, but it's mainly about being at the Royal and specifically being in the medical department of the Royal Infirmary.
Okay, and the book is your reminiscences, really, and many, many funny but also heartbreaking anecdotes from your career in medicine. Is your claim that it's 100% non-fiction, or is there a fictitious element to it?
No, it's very much a fictional memoir, and I specify that. Memoirs are notoriously unreliable. Our memories, you can, most of us can remember what we had for a breakfast and all that. But, casting your mind back 30 years ago, inevitably the stories are going to be distorted in some way. And, I would certainly not claim that this is a history of that time of the Royal Infirmary. There are many good books on that. I know that Harry Gray's written a historical account of the endocrinology department. So it's not that kind of book. It's very much one's own fictional take on memories, unreliable.
Okay, and along these lines, for many of the people you feature in the book, you use pseudonyms. And one of the
right.
joys I found, and I know many others have found in reading the book, is trying to put proper names to the pseudonyms. So what was the purpose of using pseudonyms rather than real names?
Well, again, if you use real names, you do run the risk of it being essentially a historical account, and you have to have the facts absolutely there. And it would be not unreasonable for someone to turn around and say, "You've named me there," and actually that's not what happened 30 years ago. So there's that angle. The other angle is that by doing that, it does give you a bit of artistic license to make one story a little bit funnier than maybe it actually was, or a bit sadder than it actually was. So it means you can introduce that, those kind of literary techniques, if you like.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you about the literary side of things, and I will in a bit of time. Yeah. Did you have any way of choosing the pseudonyms, or was it just what came to mind, or was there a pattern to?
There are. There are some stories behind those that are kind of in-jokey. For example, I was thinking about one of them the other night there, which is the character Scott in the book. How did I come up with Scott? And I think that was something to do with the fact that when I was a kid at primary school, they had this thing where they asked the kids to save up money, and at the end of a month or so of saving up pennies, you got to something like 2 and 6, and you got this little piece, this card, which had a picture of an African kid. And the deal was that you could name this kid, which is, a nice thing for children to do. But basically, the faith-based school that I went to, they had this rule: you had to call this child by a saint's name. And so when I went up with my card, and the teacher said, "What would you like to call this wee boy?" And at that time I was obsessed by Thunderbirds. And so I said, "Virgil." And the teacher said, no, you can't have a Saint Virgil. And so I went to Scott, and she said, no, you can't have a Saint Scott. And I think I eventually called him John. But that's one of the, it's that kind of thing. There's
a Thunderbirds illusion. There we are. Now,
Thunderbirds illusion, yeah.
I'm not going to spoil it, because clearly there's some very, very funny anecdotes in the book from Glasgow Royal Infirmary days. And I have to say I was both gripping my sides and crying at the same time. But were there any anecdotes that didn't make the book for various reasons?
Yeah, some, could be potentially, some people would regard some things as potentially tasteless. So I won't say those stories. But one that I just remembered the other day there that I'd completely forgotten about, there's a character called Dr. Hasty, who's one of the consultants. And I'll never forget, there was a day he came in to say there was an elective student coming to work with us, and he had the letter. And he said, "You're not going to guess what this doctor's name is." And I said, "No, I don't know." And he said, "It's Dr. Hitler." And he showed me the letter, and I actually said that, Dr. Hitler, and the two of us were just absolutely nuts. The idea that there could be someone out there, practicing whose name was Dr. Hitler. It turned out, obviously, that wasn't his name. It was a misspelling. It was something completely different. But the idea of actually going up to someone and saying, "Hello, Mrs. Smith, my name's Dr. Hitler," So yeah, I think there were funnier stories than that. That's why that one didn't make the cut.
Okay. And I've had a question from John Stewart, who's also one of the friends of the GRI, and you may remember from your days, because you do mention the Manx Bar in the book, and you may have to tell the audience what the Manx Bar was. And he says, "Did you ever enjoy a pint in the Manx Bar?" And that's a clever question, because there's two bits to that, isn't there? Number one, did you ever have a drink? Did you ever have a pint in the Manx Bar? And secondly, perchance, did you enjoy it?
I did have drinks in the Manx Bar. I'm trying to remember if I make an allusion to something called the Blue Monkey. And I don't know if the Manx served the Blue Monkey. The rumour always was the Saracen's Head sold the Blue Monkey being methylated spirits. I mean, I never ordered a Blue Monkey, but I'm pretty sure I had pints in the Manx bar. But anyway, the Manx bar was almost directly across from Casualty in the Royal Infirmary. It was in that small, there's a kind of lane that leads on to Townhead where there used to be a post office. And it was a single story building. And I never really questioned that at that time, why this was a single story building. And I mean, one of the things I don't talk about in the book is the whole business of the Townhead interchange, which I'm sure a lot of the people, the Friends of the Royal Infirmary, know a lot about. But the guys who came up with that are the guys who are really responsible for the fact that the Manx Bar was just this single layered, single story building. Because back in the day, that was, you know, a sequence of very nice, architecturally nice tenements. And it was a guy called Abercrombie and a guy called Burns, the Burns Report, around about 1948 or so. They came up with the idea of getting rid of all this stuff because, you know, some of the housing was not so good. And so essentially they were the people who came up with the idea of a new town like East Kilbride, which is kind of ironic because that's where I come from. And then going up to the area of the Royal Infirmary, which these guys essentially, they did a kind of, almost like a Hanoi on it. It was like a Operation Rolling Thunder, to use the Vietnam analogies in the book. They flattened the joint and they wanted to, see, I didn't know this until quite recently. They wanted to pull down the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery. They wanted to pull down Glasgow School of Art. They wanted to pull down Glasgow Central. And they wanted to pull down the Royal Infirmary. This is extraordinary to me. You know, this is absolute, as I say, Hanoi. And so that interests me because that's, you know, when you looked out of the Royal Infirmary, you were getting this memory, this sort of residue of what used to be there. I mean, of course, when you go down the High Street, architecturally, there's still bits there. And I was reading, there's actually a building directly across from High Street Station that they're trying to renovate just now, which would be fantastic because a lot of the architecture around the area is incredibly historic. You know, all sorts of layers of fascinating history. And it's quite sad that those guys decided to flatten it. But the Manx was one of the more interesting residues from that period, if you like.
Okay, and so you mentioned a bit the Vietnam analogy there. What would you say your literary influences were in writing this fictitious memoir?
Very much the time. Apocalypse Now was the big movie, and Apocalypse Now, the screenplay was by Michael Herr, who wrote a book called Dispatches. And there was a group of writers back then in the early 80s, Michael Herr, Tim O'Brien, and Tobias Wolff. Many of them were actually involved in the scripts of various other Hollywood movies. But their style of writing was very much anecdotal of various traumas or funny things going on. So they're very, very much episodic in terms of literary structure.
Okay, and I mean, I very much felt you describe your nights on call as a med rage, really gripped by fear for most of the night, and it seemed to me quite analogous to the soldiers before they're about to go into battle. Number one, was that deliberate? And I'm sure it was. But number two, is that really how you felt in these days?
No, I think, again, there's a lot of exaggeration in that. One of the things I did do, though, is I think I was very, very superstitious. I definitely had a kind of mental game that I would play that if I could think of the various wards, it was a really stupid thing to do. I'd be lying there trying to get to sleep. So I would say in my head, Ward 10, Ward 11, chest. I'd go through the whole thing, and it was a way of saying, yeah, if I can think of that ward in my head and what it does, then no trouble will happen there. And of course, I'd forget something like orthopedics, and then 2 a.m. they'd phone me up, and I'd think, if only I'd remembered that, they wouldn't have phoned me. It was complete nonsense, of course.
And what about Scottish or even Glaswegian literary influences in the book? Have you consciously or subconsciously taken on some of them?
I think it's very hard to, want to write at all in Glasgow without being aware of Alistair Gray. And of course, Alistair Gray was famously a patient in the Royal Infirmary, but when he went down into the bowels of the GRI, there's all those pipes and cladding and things like that. And I think it's on record that he used that in Lanark. So Alistair Gray structurally learned quite a lot from Andrew O'Hagan as well, who was a young writer at that time when I was there.
And what are you aware of it, apart from Alistair Gray, any other authors that have featured Glasgow Royal Infirmary in their literature?
Another author who I don't think gets the credit that he really deserves is William Vanni. His brother Hugh is a bit better known as he was better known, they're both dead now, better known as a sports writer. Vanni was a fantastic writer, and in the early 80s, he wrote these detective novels, kind of before Ian Rankin, if you like, featuring a detective called Laidlaw. And Laidlaw, in the second novel, The Papers of Tony Veitch, the detective goes to casualty in the Royal, and he visits a place called Room 9, which, again, the older physicians will remember. This is where the resuscitation was held, and a wee place called Cubicle E, which is where people essentially were hosed down, the folks that were sadly down and outs. So Vanni was very much into that. In fact, a tip for anyone that fancies reading Vanni, I'm pretty sure Ian Rankin is currently at work on, there was a final Laidlaw novel, and I think that's coming out pretty soon, and Rankin was cleaning it up, if you like.
Now, one of the literary maybe devices that occur in the book, you swear a lot. There's a large usage of the F word.
Yeah.
Was that, again, based on any particular thoughts of Scottish literature, or?
Not so much Scots literature. There's a French, an infamous French writer called Louis Ferdinand Céline, who was a GP in Paris. He became infamous because he sided with Vichy France and ended up on the run, and almost was lynched at the end of the Second World War. His style is very much repetitive use of, quite often swear words. And I thought, particularly in the parts of the book where I described life in the casualty department, that was accurate. I mean, again, to talk about Scotland and Scottish writers, Irvine Welsh is, notoriously another writer that swears a lot. A lot of Billy Connolly's humour, Limmy's humour is about swearing. There is something about Glaswegian swearing, particularly East End Glaswegian swearing. And
of course, if you swear so frequently, eventually it gets filtered out, so you don't actually notice the swearing as well.
That's right. That's right.
So 1992, I left the Royal Infirmary to go to Paisley. You actually went quite a bit further. So you went down, completed your training in England, and then got a consultant job. And in reflection back now, what do you think the biggest differences that you could see between the health service in your time in Scotland and the time in England?
I guess the main political thing would be it seemed to me that there was more funding available in Scottish hospitals. Now I'm not a politician, so I can't get into the actual statistics of that. But it certainly seemed as if there were that staffing was a bit better, and various facilities, computing and things like that back at that time. Because obviously one of the things that is there in the book is trying to compare and contrast the two. The more comedy angle, if you like, was one of the first things I noticed was that English seniors, English consultants, didn't seem to want to write in case notes, which I thought was fascinating. Almost every senior doctor I'd worked with in Scotland was perfectly happy to write in case notes. But there was this thing down south where people would, they would call junior doctors scribes. So it was, I mean, it was quite hard not to sort of see a kind of class-based thing going on there, maybe some sort of throwback to Empire or something like that. But there was this kind of instantaneous dysgraphia came across them. Oh, I can't seem to do that. And there's always that sneaking suspicion as well that this was some kind of crazed defense mechanism as well. They could stand up in court and say, I never said that, he just wrote, that's him that wrote that, not me. Maybe that's unfair, but you know, it struck me, and it still strikes me as not particularly smart behaviour.
One of the things that strikes me about your book, John, is that it's a book of strong emotions. You know, there's a lot of anger in the book, particularly, I think, some of your interactions with colleagues in England. There's also a lot of affection, and again, the affections both with colleagues and with patients. Do you think there's still space in the NHS for these strong emotions? Can strong emotions?
I would hope. Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, there's a lot of books by doctors out there just now, which might have something to do with the lockdown, or you know, and the fact that the public are interested in what doctors are making of what has happened over the last 2 years. But it struck me that most of the books were essentially polemical books. They were really dealing with the political response to the COVID disaster, rather than taking a kind of more longer term view. And again, one of the things about making it fictional is it kind of empowers you to let go that way with emotions that, you know, there are exaggerations there that in real life I would say, well, actually I wasn't that bothered about that, but it looks good when you write it down.
Now, one of the things, music plays a large part in the book and in your life, I think. Is there any place that people can hear the music that's described in the book?
Yeah, I can't remember now who it was, but someone asked me if, yeah, it was actually a colleague who's over in Ireland contacted me and said, you know, can we hear some of this stuff? So yeah, I did put, there is on Spotify a playlist. You're absolutely right that particularly in Glasgow at that time, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of cliches about Glasgow at that time, which I did want to kind of counter in a way, because obviously people are going to say, oh, here we go again, Glasgow, violence, stabbings, all that stuff. At that time, Glasgow was, I mean, it still is a very vibrant city, particularly in the contemporary art scene just now. But back in the early 80s, musically, it was, as you know, Miles, it was fantastic. There were any number of really good bands around at that time. So I did want to capture that as a kind of soundtrack to what else was going on. There were other things outside of A&E. I was particularly happy to work in the Royal Infirmary as opposed to the Western at that time. I was to say that to the friends of the Royal Infirmary, because the Royal was much closer to, you know, the music scene at that time. Most of the bands I went to see were either at the Barrowlands or down in the various clubs in the city centre. I very much wanted to be there and not over in Byres Road. I had quite strong opinions about Byres Road when I was a young man. I like it now.
Good. I'm sure when they make a TV adaptation or a movie of your book, the soundtrack is almost written itself. But can I pin you down to consider maybe one song that captures either, you know, your personal thoughts around Glasgow Royal Infirmary, or the Royal Infirmary as an institution, or even as a collection of friends that all work together? What one song do you think captures GRI?
Well, this would be quite a personal choice, really, and that's a song by a band that I didn't really like when they first came out. A band called Japan, who were some people thought of them as new romantics, but then they became much more moody and Joy Division-y, and they had a song on an album called Tin Drum. It was a song called Sons of Pioneers, and I used to play that a lot about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. when I was on call, and just stare out over the M8, which was a fantastically, the GRI is a fantastically cinematic building. I can't think of a hospital that architecturally, if you think about it, what other hospital looks like the GRI? I can't think. It looks like something out of, Istanbul or something like that.
It's almost Blade Runner as well, isn't it? The sort of
yeah, exactly.
Faded grandeur overlooking the city. Yeah,
absolutely. So, Sons of Pioneers is a kind of moody 1 a.m. track about looking out over the M8 and being on call, which I guess is a bit serious. But the book is often aimed at comedy, but the GRI is fundamentally a very, very serious place. It's not a place for fucking comedians, to use the phrase in the book. The people I worked with were not comedians. They were people who were absolutely dedicated to doing the best job in medicine, and they conveyed that in a way that I thought was, in a sense, different to what I was hearing from the other side of the city.
I've got a couple of questions that have come in that I'm going to pose as rhetorical questions. One of them is actually a question from an Australian gentleman called Lance Ritchie, I believe, and he wants to know what you and your wife are doing at the weekend. So I think we'll pose that one as a rhetorical question. And then the other one, actually, it looks questions for myself. Question is, why am I sitting here in cycling gear? Could I not be bothered to put a shirt on? So I think we'll pose them as rhetorical questions, and we'll answer them or get them answered by reminding people where they can get hold of your book, John. So your book, Dr. Quinn Medicine Man, how does somebody that wants to read it, and I would highly recommend everyone to read it. It's a joy to read. How do they get hold of the book?
That's lovely to hear, Miles. Thanks very much. Currently, you can buy it online in Amazon and Waterstones and all the various online outlets. Hopefully, it will be in the actual shops as of a week on Monday. If anyone's interested in a cheeky signed copy, there's a bookshop here in Hove and Brighton and Hove called City Books. And City Books have got some with my scrawl.
That's the advert over. My brown envelope will be coming through the post, I guess. My final question to you, John. Now that the first book's out the way, do you have any plans for other books?
I hope so. Getting books out there published is not straightforward, but that's where I'm hoping, fingers and toes crossed. Yeah.
So thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Mel. It's been a pleasure.
This afternoon, I've had the joy of speaking to Dr. John Quin, publisher of a book, Dr. Quinn Medicine Man, available from Amazon and from all good bookstores. Thank you for your attention.